The most polarizing member of the Memphis Grizzlies roster is Dillon Brooks, and his future is something that has been hotly debated in the immediate aftermath of the Grizzlies season concluding in Los Angeles due to a blowout defeat in Game 6. Dillon had some interesting things to say in his end-of-season media availability, and we think that there are arguments for and against keeping Dillon Brooks around in Memphis with the Grizzlies. We're going to talk about that and more on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax, joined by your other host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. I am a columnist on the Grizzlies for Bluff City Media, and I also write for SB Nation. Make sure you're checking out our work at Damichael C on Twitter for Damichael and at Joe Mullinax for me. Obviously, you're here because this is a Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, free and available wherever you get your podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Make sure you're checking us out wherever you get your podcasts as well as over on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. But thank you so much to everybody that made our Monday episode of Locked On Grizzlies the most watched episode of Locked On Grizzlies ever. Made history on Monday. There's pros and cons to that. Shout out to the Grizzlies folks in the comments that were defending us over on Monday's episode. It's appreciated. Our everydayers, Damichael. We got to shout out those everydayers that have been with us since day one, Uso style for the WWE fans. But we appreciate everybody that watches. You don't have to agree with us, like us. You know, I've been covering the Grizzlies for 10 years now, and Lord knows not everybody likes me. But, you know, whether you're with us, against us, with me, against me, whatever the case might be, everybody's with Damichael. I mean, look at Damichael. How could you be against Damichael? That doesn't make any logical sense. But thank you for helping us make history with our Monday episode of Locked On Grizzlies. It is much appreciated. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. We're going to leave Game 6 in the dust, kind of, sort of. We'll briefly mention it here or there. It was a pretty depressing situation all around, and we are now officially in the offseason, Damichael, and the biggest question, aside from health, which we're going to talk more about on Wednesday's episode of Locked On Grizzlies, the biggest question facing the Memphis Grizzlies entering this postseason is Dillon Brooks and his future with the Memphis Grizzlies. You were there on Sunday for the Grizzlies' end-of-season media availability, and there were two very different stories, I thought, being told in the conversation around Dillon Brooks. There was Dillon Brooks' side of the story, and then, of course, there was Zach Kleiman, Taylor Jenkins, their side of the story. I believe you mentioned it on the Monday episode, that usually they're very deliberate, very specific, how they handle things, how they discuss things. And you know, Dillon was kind of conspicuous by his absence when it comes to Kleiman and Jenkins, and Kleiman basically shut down fully talking about Dillon because he is the only unrestricted free agent on the team, and he is, you know, going to be on the market here pretty soon. On Dillon's side, he said he expected to be back, but, you know, his agent was going to take care of those things. But as we mentioned a little bit on yesterday's show, the reality is Dillon made it very clear that he didn't really plan on changing very much. You know, Ja talked about change, and Kleiman talked about change, and Jenkins talked about change. Pretty much everybody that was in front of a microphone brought about the need for something to change over the next several months, except for Dillon Brooks. He made it sound like more of the same.
And Joe, what was my word yesterday? What was my word yesterday?
If I remember correctly, it was change.
It was change. And that was my one word to describe, you know, what's happening here with the Grizzlies. And you know what? You just summed it up perfect. You just summed it up perfectly. At the end of the day, what I gathered more than anything is there is a new day approaching with this Grizzlies team. You know, the trash talk and all that stuff is fun. But there was a time. Now, as they get to this next level, you know, gone are the days where 50 wins is an achievement for this team. That's the expectation. Now, number 2 seed, congratulations. No one cares now because at the end of the day, you were the 2 seed this season and lost in the first round. So that achievement won't mean as much as it has over the past couple of years. Now it's about getting to that next level. And this is part of it. There's some change that has to happen. John Morant, very open to change. Taylor Jenkins said it himself. He's going to look in the mirror. He's looking over some things. He's going to, shuffle some things around. Very open to change. We mentioned how Zach Kleiman even, brought along the questions about some of the moves he made last season. Sound like he's very open to change.
Did we really need to triple down on youth?
Did we really need to triple down on youth? Sounds like a guy open to change for me, Joe. So
yes,
with all that being said, all these guys are talking about change, and then we talked to Dillon Brooks, and he said, hey, look, we say, the trash talk. Do you think that got LeBron going a little bit and all that? And he said, nah. And then he said he doesn't regret it. And he says, that's just who I am. So guess what? Next season, when Josh says, oh, I'm going to be more humble in my interviews, and he expects the team to kind of follow that, at the end of the day, Dillon Brooks is still going to be doing the Dillon Brooks thing if he's still in Memphis. So there can be a disconnect there because it sounds like Josh turning a new leaf.
I would agree. And I think that my biggest takeaway from that, and I wrote about it for SB Nation as well as Bluff City Media the past couple of days, the reality is much like the Grizzlies outgrew Jonas Valanciunas, right? He was the offensive training wheels for this team.
Yeah.
When Ja and Dez and Jaren, they were still finding their footing a couple of years ago, he was the security blanket. That's how I would describe him. He made you feel safe and warm, and you knew you could get it to Jonas. And I mean this as a compliment to him. You could get it to Jonas, and he was an efficient bucket getter as a big. They didn't need that anymore. They outgrew that. There is a need somewhere in the NBA for what Dillon Brooks provides, whether it's a rebuilding Toronto Raptors team, if they choose that route, whether it is the Houston Rockets, Detroit Pistons, Portland Trail Blazers, going back to Oregon maybe. There's lots of different ways that you can view Dillon. He is a top 100 or so player in the National Basketball Association. He talks too much, but and he's alluded to this, and I've written it about Dillon countless times to Michael. The reason he is here, the reason he's about to sign an extension that is probably north of $50 million combined, right? So because his cap hold is $17.1 million. So he's in a position where he's going to make roughly that amount of money. Doesn't have to be exactly that amount, obviously, but don't be surprised if it's a 4-year, $52 million contract. If he's going to sign some sort of deal like that, or 3-year, 52, whatever the case might be, it is not because he's some elite basketball player, some phenomenal athlete. This is a second-round draft pick who has made himself through tenacity, the way he defends, his mentality. He has made himself what he is without an elite basketball skill. And I don't mean that as an insult. He's one of the more mentally tough guys, despite what's happened the last several days. Obviously, it's ended poorly in Memphis this past season, but don't get it twisted. A lot of what the Grizzlies have been is because of Dillon Brooks. He was that cultural, mental, tenacity-driven security blanket, much like Jonas Valanciunas. The question is it now time to get rid of that blanket?
And that brings me to the next point, and I won't hover on this too long because a lot of people haven't talked about this much from Media Days, but this was one of my bigger takeaways as well. It's the fact that Dillon Brooks, I talked to him, I remember in Atlanta, the Grizzlies played in Atlanta, I think it was March. That was the first time we just got to talk about his role being different. You noticed in March, the shot attempts went down. I think it went down in February, but his shot attempts went down and he was shooting more threes, all these things. And he used the label 3-and-D, basically saying he had to readjust his role to fit the team. Then you start noticing. Then the eye test starts showing you things. The Grizzlies weren't calling plays for Dillon Brooks like they used to. You see it like I see it, Joe. His shots were basically spot up 3-pointers, and when he takes it off the dribble, and you say, "Oh boy, there goes Dillon." There wasn't, any pin downs and things like that. You see what Desmond Bane and Luke Kennard and those guys get. There was none of that for Dillon Brooks in the latter part of the season. So, talking to him at Media Day. Paraphrasing here because I'm going to write more about this too, but he basically said he's not a 3-and-D guy. That's kind of how they used him. He alluded to the fact that, he could have gotten more plays called for him that would have gotten him in a better rhythm. And some people probably laugh at that, but that was Dillon Brooks' take. He felt like he could have gotten more plays called for him that would have gotten him in a better rhythm. And he basically said the whole 3-and-D, just play defense and shoot, stand in the corner, shoot spot up 3-pointers. He said there's way more to his game than that. Now, I do think, Dillon Brooks has shown he can get to the mid-range shot and things like that. But does he make them? I will never tell you that Dillon Brooks isn't a shot creator, because I'm very impressed at his ability to get to his spots. He can get to that mid-range shot, and he gets to it a decent amount against good defense. Absolutely. But when it goes up, it's the problem. So with all that being said, it leads me to the fact that not only does it feel like there's a disconnect from the trash talking and all that perspective on the court, the Grizzlies going forward, it is very clear from Zach Kleiman, Taylor Jenkins, that Ja, Dez, and Jaren, you got the keys now. Dillon Brooks, 3-and-D Dillon Brooks, doesn't feel like that's the role he wants.
No, it doesn't. And I think that the role that he does want is more obtainable if he's somewhere else. We'll talk more about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But before we get to that, we're going to argue for reasons to keep Dillon Brooks around in Memphis, Tennessee with the Grizzlies organization. We'll talk about that after this word from Game Time. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is a wonderful place where if you're stressed out about buying tickets, like I know you have been in the past, I know I have been in the past, anybody that's ever bought a ticket for an event, you freak out. Is it a good seat? Is it cheap? How am I going to afford this? Am I going to be able to see? You get killer deals on last-minute tickets with the best price guarantee with Game Time. Plus, you get images of seat views with the lowest price guarantee. It really does make a major difference. Plus, you can get event cancellation protection, job loss protection. You can forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals right up to the day of the event. It's the fastest growing ticketing app in the country for a reason. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. We are talking positives about Dillon Brooks. What a bold strategy. We're going to try find the bright side of Dillon next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, your co-host, Grizzlies columnist over at Bluff City Media. You can also check out my work over at SB Nation. Every 2 weeks, I put a feature up for the former mothership. I'm joined by Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, Memphis Grizzlies beat writer. I'm not going to suck up to him as much as I did yesterday. Just know, Damichael, that you're wonderful. Continue the good work. We teased there, Damichael, the positivity, the bright side. And I use that phrase. People that have been following my work for a long time, they're going to know that's a deep cut. Because back in 2014, I want to say, I was tasked, I did it to myself, with finding the bright side of Tayshaun Prince. And this was after the initial trade where Tayshaun was a major piece of that Western Conference Finals run. He fell off a cliff after that and was really bad as a Memphis Grizzlies player. And I sat down and I said, okay, I'm going to write this piece 9 years ago now, which is crazy to say out loud, about good things that involve Tayshaun Prince. Here is the bright side. Let's focus on the positive. I'm dusting that off right now. The bright side of Dillon Brooks. I'm going to give you a few reasons why I would be okay with keeping Dillon Brooks around. Not saying this is actually how I feel. I'm playing devil's advocate here. So 3 reasons to keep Dillon, right? And again, I have felt this way in the past for those that have been following Locked On Grizzlies.
You were going to throw
I was going to give him $80 million. I was going to give him $80 million. So we could just leave that in the past. All right. Let's just pretend like that didn't happen.
That deal didn't ink in.
No, and it will not happen now. But again, 3 years, $52 million or something like that. That seems realistic for Dillon Brooks because again, his cap holds $17.1 million. If Memphis is going to re-sign him, it has to be somewhere in that ballpark. So anyway, number one, we talked about his impact culturally. He has been significant. Obviously, I'm playing devil's advocate here. Maybe he can change. We've seen short examples, maybe not as long enough examples as we'd like to see, but he has been a facilitator of offense. You mentioned how he took on more of a 3-and-D role. He is capable of doing these things. Doesn't mean he wants to or that he actually will in the long run, but we've seen evidence, at least some, that he's willing to do these things. Number two, he's still one of the best defensive perimeter players in the NBA. When the all defensive team comes out, if he's not second team, I think that's a mild upset. If he is, off the second team, he's going to be close. He'll be pretty high up in the others that received votes. He's one of the top 5 to 7 defensive perimeter players in the National Basketball Association. And he does it through his frame and his effort and the way that he competes on a nightly basis. His cardio is elite. He does really good work on that end of the floor. Reason number 3, it's the easiest thing to do in terms of re-signing somebody when you have their bird rights and you have the capacity to go over the cap with him. Memphis could negotiate pretty freely and easily with Dillon. Again, it's not like he's the worst basketball player in the world. He's certainly flawed, but he has his value, and it would be simpler than if the Grizzlies wanted to go out and trade Dillon for OG Anunoby, because there would be additional resources, sign and trade kinds of things. It becomes more complicated from there. So those are my devil's advocate, bright sides of Dillon Brooks' reasons for him to stick around.
Okay. And my reasons aren't necessarily devil's advocate, I would say. I think this is just realism of how this thing could really play out. Just have a couple. Mm-hmm. Number one is you got to examine the market and be real with yourself. Let's rehash some things we've said in the past. One of those things me and you have touched on is the Grizzlies were aggressive at the trade deadline. Right. No matter what the results may have showed you, the Grizzlies did everything they could to make that move that would have pleased, a large portion of the fan base,
including me.
Yeah, including you, Joe. The effort was there. So guess what? The effort's going to be there in the summer to do the same exact thing. That does not mean that a deal will get done in any way. So if a deal doesn't get done, Dillon Brooks has to be kind of like your fallback option.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, the Grizzlies only have a mid-level exception through free agency. So let's say, hey, you can't go out here and you can't trade. You can't make a trade because that's how the Grizzlies realistically are going to have to operate this offseason. We've touched all on it. 14 roster spots are pretty much secured. You only have one open roster spot right now for free agency, and that's the Dillon Brooks spot. So with that being said, Dillon Brooks is a free agent, and there are other free agents out there. You mentioned you can bring Dillon Brooks back at a higher number, whereas the other guys, you're capped out at that 12.2 mid-level exception. The Grizzlies are above the salary cap. Remember, Morant's contract kicks in along with Jaren Jackson Jr.'s. The days of having salary cap space, those are in the past for the Memphis Grizzlies for the foreseeable future. So with that being said, Dillon Brooks is probably going to be a fallback option. If you don't get that trade, you're going to have to act fast. And there aren't a lot of wing players out there that you can get for the mid-level exception that I think would qualify as big upgrades over a guy like Dillon Brooks. Sure, there are some guys. I'm going to throw out one of Joe's favorite Grizzlies of all time, Jay Crowder. He loves that guy. He loves
Don't be that guy, Damichael. Don't bring that guy up. He couldn't even play. The Bucks season was on the line. You did this on purpose, Damichael Cole. The Bucks season was on the line, and he couldn't even play.
He couldn't even play. And you know what he did? He complained. He complained about his role for 2 teams in 1 season. So I don't know.
That dude needs to be playing for the Shanghai Sharks in China is where Jay Crowder needs to be.
Send him to the CBA, says Joe.
Go to the CBA. Golly day.
I just got Joe riled up there, everyone. That wasn't my intentions, but okay, it was.
Yes, it was. Intention. Be honest with our attention. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it was my intentions. But
be honest with our everydayers, Damichael.
So the other thing here is you touched on it. The perimeter defense, the Grizzlies can use it.
It's very real.
And when I say
bad at that,
yeah, and when I say they can use it right now, let's say they don't sign anyone, and you go get a middle of the pack type guy who could be a starter or who may come off the bench. Now you're looking at possibly the David Roddy, Jake LaRavia, Zaire Williams of the world. Possibly Luke Kennard. And remember, in that series against the Lakers, a lot of people were asking, why wasn't Luke Kennard in the game in certain stretches in Game 4, Game 3? And I asked Taylor Jenkins about that. He was talking about the fact of LeBron James going at Ja Morant, and the Grizzlies only wanted to have one guy on the floor who they were going to have to hedge, meaning everyone else was switchable. They were okay with having Desmond Bane on him. They were okay with having Jaren. They were okay with having X, but Ja Morant, they did not want to do that. So Dillon Brooks was the other guy they had on the floor. If Dillon Brooks is not re-signed, you risk, yes, you could upgrade the offense, but your perimeter defense could be, no hyperbole, could be lower tier in the NBA. I'll leave it at that. Lower third. Ja Morant made some strides, but he's probably always going to be a small guy, and there's just downside to that. And then, he takes a lot of gambles. So he gets some steals sometimes, but he also is out of position on certain possessions. Desmond Bane, I like the strides that he made defensively. I think he's strong. He slides his feet very well. But again, Desmond Bane, the wingspan, you don't really care about it on offense like that. But on defense, it shows up when you got to guard Brandon Ingram and you got to guard Devin Booker, and these guys are going to that fadeaway, and they can just see right over the top of you, right over the top of you. So it matters. But Dillon Brooks makes a big difference from that perspective. I think that's where the Grizzlies can use him. But again, all of this is fallback option to me. Of course, you want to go out there, you examine the market, you go for a big-time defensive player who can shoot the ball better, who can add more offense. But, Joe, if push comes to shove, if you're talking about a vet minimum or Dillon Brooks, I think you got to go Dillon Brooks.
Some of the names that have been thrown out there, because Zach Kleiman in that end of season media availability talked about using the MLE, the mid-level exception. I don't think they've done so in some time. So he mentioned to be aggressive with that MLE. And he, when you look at guys that are going to be on the market, new friend of Locked On Grizzlies, Rui Hachimura, maybe could fit into that MLE. Bruce Brown could be another name that potentially, and now you have to re-examine and say, are those guys really better than Dillon Brooks? And, you make an argument for Rui. I don't know that you make that argument for Bruce Brown.
It's marginal.
Market, right. It's a marginal difference. Sometimes the devil is better than the devil that you don't. And that might be a great way to describe the relationship with Dillon Brooks at this stage. But the bright side's done. We're throwing that away. To end our show coming up here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're talking about reasons to move on from Dillon Brooks. And if you've been following me for a while, I'm going to come with a couple of – this is my time to shine. This is armchair GM Joe at his very best. I'm not going to give it all away because it's a long offseason, but I got a little taste for you next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Before we get to that, however, we got to give a shout-out to Prize Picks. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Prize Picks. But Prize Picks currently has the $1 million daily Superflex promotion for the NBA playoffs and the NBA Finals. Every day of the NBA playoffs and finals, one Prize Pick user will win a chance at becoming a millionaire. One entry placed after 8 a.m. will be randomly selected, Eastern time, that is. Each day, if you get 6 correct picks, you get $1 million. If you get 5 correct picks, you get $80,000. If you get 4, you get $16,000. Full details can be found at prizepicks.com/million. You have to opt in to be eligible for that $1 million entry. And Prize Picks is super fun. You pick 2 to 6 players. You're going up against just the projections available. You're not going against other people, and you can win up to 25 times your money. Obviously, the NBA playoffs are heating up, unfortunately, without the Memphis Grizzlies. But you can make your entry watching the NBA games in 60 seconds or less. They're currently operational in over 30 states as well as in Canada with safe and fast withdrawals. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter the promo code Locked On and sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. Reasons to say sayonara to Dillon Brooks next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax, joined by the other more handsome, more wonderful host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Wonderful Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. I am a Grizzlies columnist over at Bluff City Media. I also do some work over at SB Nation. Check out all of our stuff again, the Grizzlies might be done working for now, but Damichael and I, the grind continues on. Maybe not quite as intensely, which, Damichael has friends. He wants to go and be social, and I am very old and washed and need my rest. So I'm in a positive place, as is Damichael, a chance to catch our breath. But we're going to keep putting out episodes. The month of May, we're treating it like we're in season still. Your team, each and every day, the Memphis Grizzlies keep grinding on, and Damichael and I, or one of us, right? Because, again, a day off every once in a while doesn't hurt. But we will be with you almost every day in May talking this Grizzly season and what comes next. A major piece of that is what to do with Dillon Brooks. And we've talked about the disconnect at Media Day. We've talked about reasons for the bright side, right? Maybe you keep Dillon Brooks around. Now we're going to say, cut the cord, it's over. And I think we've already kind of outlined the reasons why, Damichael. I think we've talked about that disconnect between the Grizzlies trying to mature and grow up and change a little bit, and Dillon Brooks not necessarily wanting that. That is all culturally based. We haven't even talked about the fact that Dillon just had his worst offensive season of his career, and it's not really close in terms of how poor he shot the basketball. On one hand, you could argue he's going to progress to the mean. On the other hand, if you allow for him to be what he wants to be, especially in Memphis, where he started 300-plus games.
Yeah.
I have always said that Dillon Brooks is an ideal sixth man. He's a guy that can come in against reserves and perhaps be more efficient in his scoring role. He could come in and be your defensive stopper at the end of games, where maybe you alternate with an offensive talented player.
Yeah.
The Portland Trailblazers stand out at the top of my mind. Anthony Simons is your offensive guy at the end of games. Dillon Brooks is your defensive guy. And that way you don't have Lillard and Simons on the court together. So that's just one example of a place where I could see Dillon making sense. And whether it's in free agency or via sign and trade, which allows for more teams to be involved in the market that maybe are over the cap, there's lots of different ways that Dillon can be moved on from. I think the time is now. The reality is, if they do move on from Dillon, they have to find a comparable defender, somebody that can be of that ilk. I think there are options out there, Damichael. But to me, the biggest reason to move on from Dillon, we've already kind of outlined. It feels like the team has outgrown him, and he's not willing to make the changes that the team is going to make. And I think if he goes to a new environment, it will allow for him to maybe make those changes. Like, imagine him as a sixth man in Portland or as a sixth man in Toronto. I think that he, those are places he's obviously very familiar with. I think he might thrive in those spots.
Yeah. And I can see that. I've said kind of at the beginning of the season, I wouldn't have been surprised if at some point during the season, if he kind of transitioned into that role. But then you got to factor in the fact that he's the longest tenured player here, and how he's
too much baggage.
Yeah, it's too much. But that's an ideal role for him somewhere else. And you touched on pretty much the most important things. But if we want to talk basketball and with the Grizzlies, how that works is it's simple. Ja Morant is below league average shooter right now at this point. You just keeping it real. Desmond Bane is well above league average. He's an elite shooter. Jaren Jackson Jr. is above league average. And for his position, very solid shooter. If you get a third guy who's above league average as a shooter on the floor with Ja Morant, three guys where teams will say, oh, no, we can't leave him open. You got problems. The other team does. There will be problems guarding the Memphis Grizzlies. There was comfort, I think, in teams knowing that, hey, if Ja starts cooking us, we can always just bring Dillon Brooks' defender over there and settle things down. And Dillon even said it himself. I think he said it in the exit interviews. He was like, man, it were just possessions where they just didn't guard him. It's never happened for Dillon Brooks before. Like, you got to remember, there's a psych to this stuff. The psych to this stuff is everyone in the NBA was probably the best player growing up. Right. And when I say the best player, everyone probably was praising them and, oh, you're going to be this, you're going to be that. You go from that to going in the league, and now they're just like, leave him open. He's nobody. Like, there's a psych to that. And Dillon Brooks just experienced it. But clearly, we looked at the numbers. I mean, we talked about the numbers. When Luke Kennard was on the floor the Grizzlies were so much better in that series against the Lakers as opposed to Dillon Brooks being alongside of Desmond Bane. So the numbers show that if the Grizzlies get another shooter who is, Luke Kennard isn't a great defender by any means. So if you get a great defender plus a decent shooter who's respected to go alongside that group, where Ja can put his head down and go to the rim and doesn't have to worry about 3-4 guys meeting him in the paint and teams saying, hey, as long as we guard Desmond Bane, we're good. Because that's what teams are doing. And that kind of changes the whole trajectory of this thing. So, that's my take. Like Dillon Brooks, I don't know the whole sign and trade thing. We'll see. Because I think at the end of the day, the Grizzlies have desirable draft picks in the future, and they have other players, which, Joe, you actually brought up on this show, which we'll talk more about over the course of the offseason, where I think those are more desirable ways to go out and get those other players. Dillon Brooks, I think it's probably just going to be best to just say, hey, that ship has sailed. Thank you for the 6 years, and you are a big part of the culture shift that happened.
I think that if they're going to go the sign and trade route with Dillon, they're going to have to overpay for someone. And, OG Anunoby of the Toronto Raptors stands out in my mind. Again, part of the sign and trade is the guy has to want to go there, right? So Dillon, being an Ontario native from Canada, it makes sense that he would potentially want to go play for the Raptors. But in order for Toronto to take on Dillon Brooks, OG Anunoby, one of the better young wings in the NBA, that's probably going to be at least 3 first-round picks. Is Memphis willing to part with that for an OG Anunoby? Jeremy Grant in Portland is in a similar situation where he is now an unrestricted free agent. If Dillon wants to go to Portland and Grant, for whatever reason, wants to come to Memphis, or they find a way to get Grant to Memphis, that's going to involve multiple sign and trades. There's a lot more moving pieces. And again, Jeremy Grant better than Dillon Brooks. Some first-round picks are going to have to be sent out. There are other players that could potentially be acquired who maybe fill that Dillon void. Yeah. We've talked about Alex Caruso in the past here on Locked On Grizzlies, and we'll talk about him again.
That's your guy.
I promise you, it is one of my guys.
Yeah.
I'm warming up to the idea of Dorian Finney-Smith of the Brooklyn Nets because he can play the 3 and the 4, right? He's one of those kinds of hybrid guys who maybe helps offset the fact that Brandon Clark won't be there. And the Brooklyn Nets are almost entirely wings right now. They could probably use a point guard who can facilitate offense and start at that level. Do you know anybody who on the Grizzlies could potentially be a starting point guard?
I know a guy who's led the league in assists.
Yeah, and again, we're gonna talk more about this, right? Like I want to stress this is just the tip of the iceberg, but the wheels have been churning here, Damichael. I think there is a lane for the Grizzlies, depending on how froggy they want to get. They can leap all over the NBA in terms of getting a contributor here, a contributor there. It's going to cost a lot. Like, they won't have very many draft picks when it's done, but you can improve your overall team defense. You can improve your offensive situation and find yourself in a spot where your team is more solidified, your roster is more together, and part of that's going to be finding a way to utilize that Dillon Brooks sign and trade. So I think that is a major cog to this, that they have to find a way to sell somebody on what Dillon Brooks brings to the table. And again, if Portland wants to try to save a little money, right? Jeremy Grant's going to be more expensive than Dillon Brooks. If Toronto wants to save some money, OG Anunoby is about to make his own 9-figure, close to 9-figure extension. So is Memphis willing to do that? We've heard a lot about the 5th richest owner in professional sports in North America, Robert Pera, being willing to spend the luxury tax. Well, OG Anunoby being your 4th piece, that could be your opportunity. So we're going to talk more about that as the season goes on, or the offseason, goes on here on Locked On Grizzlies. But I think the time has come to move on from Dillon. It sounds like, Damichael, don't want to put words in your mouth, but you kind of agree with that sentiment.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your 6 years. I think that's a great way to put it. People are going to leave.
Big culture shift guy.
Yeah. Right. It's important. I was there. I was running Grizzly Bear Blues when the team was bad. And I watched Dillon Brooks be the best player due to injuries to Mike Conley and Marc Gasol on that team that legitimately earned Jaren Jackson Jr. because they were the 4th worst team in the National Basketball Association.
Mm-hmm.
So I watched that 2017-2018 team. Don't fault Dillon Brooks for who he is, because you know who has a major reason, a major role to play in why Dillon Brooks is who he is? He obviously needs to take accountability for poking the bear that is LeBron James and for other things he's done. But don't be mad at Dillon because he wants to be a starter. He's been a starter almost the entire time he's been a Memphis Grizzly. He was asked to do more than he should have done when he was a rookie. There are consequences for these things, and I hope that Dillon will have a positive perception eventually. Right now, lots of folks aren't very happy with him. I hope that shifts as time goes on. Thank you so much for listening, watching Locked On Grizzlies, however you're checking out the podcast, whether it's on YouTube, whether it is wherever you get your podcasts, your team each and every day here at Locked On Grizzlies. And we appreciate our everydayers. We mentioned them earlier in the show, the folks that stood up for us, or at least stood up for me. As Lakers fans made it clear they were not happy with my analysis. I appreciate those of you that said, hey, this is Locked On Grizzlies, there's going to be a Grizzlies spin. So thank you for that. It's appreciated. Continue to stay with us each and every day through the offseason. Like I said earlier, almost every day in May, we're going to have a show for you. The offseason has begun for the Grizzlies, but we're going to keep grinding and working. And speaking of that, on Wednesday's episode, Damichael, we've got some injuries to talk about. Some,
bunch of them.
Desmond Bain, Steven Adams, Brandon Clark. What is this team going to do?
Yeah.
We can, maybe even if we can work in the time. Again, it's a long off season. We can probably wait for a future episode. But the fact that Jaren Jackson Jr. is not injured, right? Like there's some positivity there as well. So I think the Wednesday episode might be a good time to lean on the old beat writer and get some injury updates.
Hey, I'm all for it. And there's so much we have to hit on because it's not even just the guys who were out. As it turns out, we learned that a lot of those guys who played were dealing with some things, but we'll get to that. Stay tuned for it on tomorrow's episode.
Stay tuned for it on tomorrow's episode. For the wonderful Damichael Cole, I am Joe Mullinax. Again, thank you so much. History was made on Monday with our most successful episode in terms of downloads and views ever. It is appreciated. Let's keep that momentum and energy going into the off season. So for Damichael, I'm Joe. Until tomorrow, enjoy the rest of your day. Stay locked in with us here at Locked On Grizzlies.